Chapter 2. The rain still fell lightly, but with the elusive suddenness of an angel, a rainbow had already appeared. In languorous self-wonder, a pinkish green with a purplish suffusion along its inner edge, it hung suspended over the reaped field, above and before a distant wood, one tremulous portion of which showed through it. Straight arrows of rain had lost both rhythm and weight, and the ability to make any sound flashed at random this way and that in the sun. Up the rain-washed sky from behind a raven cloud, a cloud ravishing whiteness was extricating itself and shining with it all the detail of a monstrously complicated molding. Well, it's over, he said in a low voice, and emerged from under the shelter of aspens that crowded where the greasy clayey Zimskaya rural district road. And what a bump in his designation! Descended into a hollow gathering there, all its ruts into oblong pit, full to the brim with thick cafe cream. My darling, pattern of Eleusinian hues. Once in Ordos, my father, climbing a hill after a storm, inadvertently entered the base of a rainbow, the rarest occurrence, and found himself in colored air, and a play of light as if in paradise. He took one more step and left paradise. The rainbow was already fading. The rain had quite stopped. It was scorching hot. A horsefly with satiny eyes settled on his sleeve. A cuckoo began to call in a copse, listlessly, almost questioningly. The sound swelled like a couple, and again like a couple, unable to find a solution. The poor fat bird probably flew further away, for everything was repeated from beginning in a manner of reduced reflection. It sought, who knows, a place for the best, the saddest effect. A huge butterfly, flat in flight, bluish-black with a white band, described a supernaturally smooth arc, settled on the damp earth, closed its wings, and with that disappeared. This is the kind that now and then a panting peasant lad brings one, cramming it with both hands into his cap. This is the kind that soars out from under the mincing hooves of the doctor's well-behaved little pony, when the doctor, holding the most superfluous reins in his lap, or else simply trying them to the front board, pensively drives along the shady road to the hospital. But on occasion you find 4 black and white wings, with brick-colored undersides scattered like playing cards over a forest footpath, the rest eaten by an unknown bird. He jumped a puddle where 2 dung beetles had fastened onto a straw, getting in each other's way, and printed his soul on the edge of the road, a highly significant footprint, ever looking upward and ever seeing him who was vanished. Walking through a field alone beneath the magnificently rushing clouds, he remembered now, with his first cigarettes and his first cigarette case, he had approached an old reaper here and asked for a light. The peasant had taken out a box, and his gaunt breast had given it to him unsmilingly, and the wind was blowing. Match after match went out before he had finally hardly flared, and after one he grew more ashamed, while the man watched with a kind of detached curiosity the impatient fingers of a wasteful young squire. He went deeper into the wood. Planks had been laid along the path, black and slimy and reddish-brown aments and leaves that had stuck to them. Who was this who had dropped Russia, breaking open its white fan? In reply came the sound of a hallooing. Girls were gathering mushrooms and bilberries, the latter seeming much darker in the basket than on their stalks. Among the birches there was an old acquaintance, with a double trunk, a birch lyre, and beside it an old post with a board on it. Nothing could be made on it, except bullet marks. A Browning had once been fired at by this English tutor, also Browning, and then father had taken the pistol swiftly and dexterously, ramming bullets into the clip, and knocked out a smooth K with 7 shots. Farther on, a bog orchis bloomed unceremoniously on a patch of marshy ground, behind which he had to cross a black road, and off to the right a white wicket gate gleamed, the entrance to the park, trimmed with ferns outside, luxuriantly lined with jasmine and honeysuckle inside, in places darkened by fir needles, and others lightened by birch leaves. This huge, dense, and multi-patched dark stood poised in an equilibrium of sun and shadow, which formed from night to night a variable, but in its variability a uniquely characteristic harmony. If circles of warm light palpitated underfoot an avenue, then a thick velvet stripe was sure to stretch across in the distance. Behind it again came that tawny sieve, while further at the bottom there deepened a rich blackness that transferred to paper would satisfy the watercolorist only as long as the paint remained wet, so that he could not have put on layer after layer to maintain its beauty, which would immediately fade. All paths led to the house, but geometry notwithstanding, it seemed the quickest way was not by the straight avenue, slim and sleek, with sensitive shadow, rising like a blind woman to meet you and touch your face, and with a burst of emerald sunlight at the very end, but by any of its tortuous and unweeded neighbors. He walked along his favorite one toward the still invisible house, past the bench on which, according to the established tradition, his parents used to sit on the eve of his father's regular departures on his travels. Farther, knees apart, twirling his spectacles or a carnation in his hands, had his head lowered, with a boulder chipped onto the back of it, and with a taciturn, almost mocking smile around his puckered eyes, and in the soft corners of his mouth, somewhere in the very roots of his trimmed beard, and Mother was telling him something from the side, from below, from beneath her large, trembling white hat, or was pressing out crunchy little holes in the dumb sand with the tip of her parasol. He walked past a boulder, with rowan saplings clambering onto it, and one had turned to offer a hand to the younger, past a small grass-grown plant which had been a pond in grandfather's time, and past some shortish fir trees, which used to become quite round in winter under their burden of snow. The snow used to fall straight and slow. It could fall like that for 3 days, 5 months, 9 years, and already had, in a clear space traversed by white specks, one glimpsed a dim yellow blotch approaching, which suddenly came into focus, shuddered, thickened, and turned into a tramcar, and the wet snow drifted slantingly, plastering over the left face of a pillar of glass. The tram stopped, while the asphalt remained black and bare, as if incapable by nature of accepting anything white, and among the signs over chemists' shops, stationers, and grocers, which swam before the eyes, and at first were even incomprehensible, one could still appear to the Breton and Welsh cacao. Meanwhile, around him, everything that had just been imagined with such pictorial clarity, which in itself was suspicious, like the vividness of dreams at the wrong time of the day or after a soporific, paled, corroded, disintegrated, and if one looked around then, as in a fairy tale the stairs disappear behind the back of whoever is mounting them, everything collapsed and disappeared, a farewell conflagration of trees standing like people come to see someone off, and already swept away, a scrap of rainbow faded in the wash, the path of which remained only the gesture of a turn, a butterfly on a pin with only 3 wings and no abdomen, a carnation in the sand, by the shade of the bench, the very last persistent odds and end, and in another moment all this yielded Fedor, without a struggle, to his present, and straight out of his reminiscence. Swift and senseless, visiting like an attack on fatal illness at any hour, at any place, straight from the hothouse paradise of the past, he stepped into a Berlin tramcar. He was going to a lesson very late as usual, and as usual there grew in him a vague, evil, heavy hatred for the clumsy sluggishness of his least gifted but all methods of transport, for the hopelessly familiar, hopelessly ugly streets going by the wet window, and most of all for the feet, sides, and necks of the native passengers. His reason knew that they could also include genuine, completely human individuals with unselfish passions, pure sorrows, and even memories shining through life, but for some reason he got the impression that all these cold, slippery eyes looking at him as if they were carrying an illegal treasure, which his gift was essentially, belonged only to malicious hags and crooked hucksters. The Russian conviction that the German is in small numbers vulgar and in large numbers unbearably vulgar was, he knew, a conviction unworthy of an artist, but nonetheless he was seized with a trembling, and only the gloomy conductor, with hunted eyes and a plaster on his finger, eternally and painfully seeking equilibrium and room to pass amidst the convulsive jolts of the car and the cattle-like crowding and standing of passengers, seemed outwardly, if not a human being, then at least a poor relation to the human being. At the second stop, a lean man in a short coat with a fox fur collar, wearing a green hat and frayed spats, sat down in front of Fedor. In settling down, he bumped him with his knee, and with the corner of a fat briefcase with a leather handle, and this trivial thing turned his irritation into a kind of pure fury, so that, staring fixedly at the sitter, reading his features, he instantly concentrated on him all his sinful hatred for this poor, pitiful, expiring nation, and knew precisely why he hated him, for that low forehead, for those pale eyes, for that full milk and extra stark, implying the awful existence of the deluded and the artificial, for the Punchinello-like system of gestures threatening children not as we do, with an upright finger, a standing reminder of divine judgment, but with a horizontal digit imitating a waving stick, for a love of fences, rows, mediocrity, for the cult of the office, for the fact that if you listen to his inner voice, or to any conversation on the street, you will inevitably hear figures, money, for the lavatory humor and crude laughter, for the fatness of the black sides of both sexes, even if the rest of the subject is not fat, for the lack of fastidiousness, for the visibility of cleanliness, the gleam of saucepan bottoms in the kitchen and the barbaric filth of the bathrooms, for the weakness of dirty little tricks, for taking pains with railings of the public gardens, for someone else's live cat pierced through with wire as revenge on a neighbor, and the wire cleverly twisted on one end, for cruelty in everything self-satisfied taken for granted, for the unexpected rapturous helpfulness with which 5 passerby help you to pick up some dropping farthings, or thus he threaded the points of his biased indictment, looking at the man who sat opposite him until the latter took a copy of Vasilev's newspaper from his pocket and coughed unconcernedly with a Russian intonation. "That's wonderful," thought Fedor, almost smiling with delight. How clever, how gracefully sly, and how essentially good life is. Now he made out in the newspaper reader's features such a compatriot softness in the corners of his eyes, large nostrils, a Russian-cut mustache, that it became at once both funny and incomprehensible how anyone could have been deceived. His thoughts were cheered by this unexpected respite, and had already taken a different turn. The pupil he was visiting was a scantily educated but inquisitive old Jew, who the previous year had conceived a sudden desire to learn how to chat in French, which seemed to the old man both more attainable and more becoming to his years, character, and experience of life than the dry study of the grammar of a language. Invariably, at the beginning of the lesson, groaning and mixing a multitude of Russian and German words with a pinch of French, he described his exhaustion after a day's work. He was manager of a sizable paper factory, and went from these lengthy complaints to a discussion in French, landing immediately up to the ears in hopeless darkness in international politics, and with this demanded miracles, that all this wild, vicious, and ponderous stuff comparable to the transportation of stones over a washed-out road should turn suddenly into filigreed speech. Entirely lacking in the ability to remember words, and liking to talk of this not as a shortcoming, but as an interesting characteristic of his nature, he not only made no progress, but even managed in a year of studying to forget those few French phrases with which Fedor had found in him, and on the basis of which the old man had thought to construct in 3 or 4 evenings his own animated, light, portable Paris. Alas, the time had passed fruitlessly, proving the futility of the effort and the impossibility of the dream, and when the instructor turned out to be an inexperienced, completely lost when the unfortunate factory manager suddenly needed exact information, what's dandy roll in French? Which out of delicacy the questioner immediately renounced, and both were momentarily embarrassed like an innocent youth and maiden in some idyll who inadvertently touch one another. It gradually became unendurable, since the pupil referred more and more despondently to the tiredness of his brain, and more often postponed the lessons. His secretary's heavenly voice on the telephone was the melody of happiness. It seemed to Fedor that the latter had finally become convinced of his teacher's ineptitude, but that he was prolonging the mutual torment out of pity for his worn trousers, and would continue to do so to the grave. And now, sitting in the tram-car, he saw with ineffable vividness how in 7 or 8 minutes he would enter the familiar study, furnished of Berliner animal luxury, would settle in the deep leather armchair beside the low metal table, with its glass cigarette box open for him, its lamp fashioned like a terrestrial globe, would light a cigarette, cross his legs with cheap gaiety, and come face to face with the agonized, submissive gaze of this hopeless pupil, would hear so clearly a sigh in the ineradicable nouveau with which he interlarded his answers, but suddenly the unpleasant feeling of lateness was replaced in Fedor's soul by a distinct and somehow outrageously joyful decision not to appear at all for the lesson, to get off at the next stop and return home to his half-read book, to his unworldly cares, to the blissful mist in which his real life floated, to the complex, happy, devout work which had occupied him for about a year already. He knew that today he would receive payment for several lessons, knew that otherwise he would have to smoke and eat again on credit, but he was quite reconciled for this to the sake of that energetic altiveness. Everything is here in this combination. For the sake of the soft, lofty truancy he was allowing himself, and he was allowing it not for the first time. Sly and exacting, living always uphill, spending all his strength in pursuit of the innumerable beings that flashed inside him as if at dawn. In a mythological grove, he could no longer force himself to mix with people either for money or for pleasure, and therefore he was poor and solitary. And as if to spite common fate, it was pleasant to recall how once in a summer he had not gone to a party in a suburban villa, solely because of the Chernyshevskys had warned him that a man would be there who perhaps could help him. or how the previous autumn he had not found time to communicate with the divorce bureau, which needed a translator because he was composing a verse drama, because the lawyer promising him his income was importunate and stupid, because finally he put it off too long and then was able to make up his mind. He worked his way out onto the car's platform. Just then the wind searched him cruelly, after which Fedor drew the belt of his mackintosh tighter and adjusted his scarf. But the small amount of tram warmth had already been taken away from him. The snow had ceased falling, but where it went no one knew. There remained only a ubiquitous dampness, which was evidenced both in the swishing sound of motor tires and the pig-like sharpness of the ear-torturing ragged squeal of car horns, and in the darkness of the day, shivering with cold, with sadness, with the loathing for itself, and in the particular shade of yellow of the already lighted shop windows, and the reflections and refractions in the liquid lights, and all this sick irritation of electric light. The tram came out on the square and, barking excruciatingly, stopped, but it was only a preliminary stop, because in front, by the stone island crowded with people standing by to board, 2 other trams had got stuck, both with cars coupled on, and this inert agglomeration was also evidence somehow of the disastrous imperfection of the world in which Fedor continued to reside. He could stand it no longer. He jumped out and strode across the slippery square to another tram line on which, by cheating, he could return to his own district on the same ticket. Good for one transfer, but not at all for a return journey. But the honest official calculation that a passenger would travel in one direction only was undermined, in certain cases, by the fact that, knowing the routes, one could turn a straight journey imperceptibly into an arc, bending back to the point of departure. This clever system, pleasant evidence of a certain purely German flaw in the planning of tram routes, was willingly followed by Fedor, from absent-mindedness, however, from an incapacity to cherish a material advantage for any length of time, and already thinking of something else, he paid automatically for the new ticket he had intended to save on. And even then the cheat prospered, and even then not he but the city transport department proved to be out of pocket, and furthermore for a much, much greater sum, the price of a Nord Express ticket, than could have been expected. Crossing the square and turning into a side street, he walked toward the tram stop through a small, at first glance, thicket of fir trees gathered here for sale on account of the approach of Christmas. They formed between them a kind of small avenue. Swinging his arms as he walked, he brushed his fingertips against the wet needles, but soon the tiny avenue broadened out. The sun burst forth, and he emerged into a garden terrace, where on the soft red sand one could make out a sigla of summer day, the imprints of a dog's paws, the beaded tracks of a wagtail, the Dunlop stripe left by Tanya's bicycle, dividing into 2 waves at the turn, and a heel dent where, with a light, mute movement, containing perhaps a quarter of a pirouette, she had slid off it to one side and started walking, keeping hold of the handlebars. An old wooden house in the so-called Abichinist style, painted a pale green with like-colored drain-pipes, carved designs under the roof, and a high stone foundation where in the grey putty one could fancy one saw the round pink cruppers of a walled-up horses. A large, sturdy, and extraordinarily expressive house with balconies on a level with the lime branches and verandas decorated with precious glass sailed forward to meet him in a cloud of swallows, with a full spread of awnings, its lighting conductor cleaving through the blue sky, and the bright white clouds extending an endless embrace. Sitting on the stone steps of the foremost veranda, illuminated squarely by the sun, our father, obviously just back from a swim, turbaned in a shaggy towel so that one cannot see, and how one would like to, his dark crop, streaked with gray, tapering to a peak on his forehead, mother in all white staring straight in front of her, and somehow so youthfully hugging her knees next to her Tanya, in an ample blouse, the end of her black braid lying on her collarbone, her smooth parting lowered, holding her arms a fox terrier whose mouth is creased in a wide smile for the heat. Higher up, Ivana Ivanovna, who for some reason has not come out, her features blurred out, but her slim waist, her belt, and her watch chain clearly visible to one side lower down. Reclining and resting his head in the lap of the round-faced girl, velvet neck ribbon, silk rose, who gave Tanya music lessons, his father's brother, and a stout army doctor, a joker and a very handsome man, lower still, 2 sour little glowering schoolboys, Fedor's cousins, one in a school cap, the other without, the one to be killed 7 years later in the Battle of Melitopol, at the very bottom on the sand, in exactly the same pose as his mother, Fedor himself, as he was then, though he had changed little since that time, white teeth, black brows, short hair, wearing an open shirt. One forgot who had taken it, but this transient, faded, and generally insignificant, but how many others or better were there? Photograph, unsuitable even for copying, had alone been saved by a miracle, and had become priceless, reaching Paris among his mother's belongings, and brought by her to Berlin last Christmas, for now choosing her son a present, she was guided not by what was most costly to get, but by what was most difficult to part with. She had come to him for 2 weeks after a 3-year separation, and in the first moment, when powdered to a deathly pallor, wearing black gloves and black stockings, and an old sealskin coat thrown open, she had descended the iron steps of the coach, glancing with equal quickness first at him and then at what was underfoot, and the next moment her face twisted with the pain of happiness, was clinging to him, blissfully moaning, kissing him anywhere, ear, neck, and it seemed to him that the beauty of which he had been so proud had faded. But as his vision adjusted itself to the twilight and the present, so different at first from the distantly receding light of memory, he again recognized in her everything that he had loved, the pure outline of her face narrowing down to the chin, the changeable play of those green, brown, yellow, and entrancing eyes under their velvet brows, the long, light stance, the avidity with which she lit a cigarette in the taxi, the attention with which she suddenly looked, unblinded, therefore, by the excitement of the meeting, as any other would have been. The grotesque scene noticed by both of them, an imperturbable motorcyclist carrying a bust of Wagner in his sidecar, and already by the time they were coming up to the house the light of the past had overtaken the present, had soaked it to the saturation point, and everything became the same as it had been in this very Berlin 3 years previously, as it had once been in Russia, as it had been and would be forever. A spare room was found at Frau Stabboy's place, and there, on the first evening, an opened dressing case, rings taken off and laid in the marble washstand, lying on the sofa and ever so quickly eating raisins, without which she would not pass a single day. She spoke of what she had constantly returned to for almost 9 years now, repeating over again, incoherently, gloomily, ashamedly, turning her eyes away, as if confessing to something secret and terrible, that she believed more and more that Fedor's father was alive, that her mourning was ridiculous, that the vague news of his death had never been confirmed by anyone, that he was somewhere in Tibet and China, in captivity, in prison, in some desperate quagmire of troubles and privations, that he was convalescing after some long illness, and suddenly flinging open the door noisily, stamping on the step, he would enter. And to an even greater degree than before, these words made Fedor feel both happier and more frightened. Accustomed willy-nilly to consider his father dead all these years, he sensed something grotesque in the possibility of his return. Was it admissible that life could perform not only miracles, but miracles necessarily deprived, otherwise they would be unbearable, of even the tiniest hint of supernatural? The miracle of this return would consist in its earthly nature, and its compatibility with reason, in the swift introduction of an incredible event into the accepted and comprehensible linkage of ordinary days. But the more the necessity for such naturalness grew with the years, the more difficult it became for life to meet it. And now what frightened him was not simply the imagining of a ghost, but the imagining of one that would not be frightening. There were days when it seemed to Fedor that suddenly on the street in Berlin there are little cul-de-sacs where at dusk the soul seems to dissolve. He would be approached by an old man of 70 in fairy-tale rags, shrouded to the eyes in a beard, who would wink and say, as he had once been wont to, "Hello, son." His father had often appeared to him in dreams, as if just returned from some monstrous penal servitude, having experienced physical tortures which it was forbidden to mention, now changed into clean linen. It was impossible to think of the body underneath, and with a completely uncharacteristic expression of unpleasant monumentous sullenness, with a sweaty brow and slightly bared teeth, sitting at the table of a circle of hushed family. But when overcoming a sensation of the spuriousness of the very style foisted on fate, he nevertheless forced himself to imagine the arrival of a live father, aged but undoubtedly his, and the most complete, most convincing possible explanation of his silent absence, he was seized not by happiness but by a sickening terror, which however immediately disappeared and yielded to a feeling of satisfied harmony when he removed this meeting beyond the boundary of earthly life. But on the other hand, it happens that over a long period you are promised a great success, in which from the very start you do not believe, so dissimilar it is from the rest of fate's offerings, and if from the time you think do think of it, then you do so as it were to indulge your fantasy. But when at last, on a very ordinary day, with a west wind blowing, the news comes, simply instantaneously and decisively destroying any hope in it, then you are suddenly amazed to find that although you did not believe in it, you had been living with it all this time, not realizing the constant, close presence of the dream, which had long since grown fat and independent, so that now you cannot get it out of your life without making a hole in that life. Thus had Fedor, in spite of all logic, and not daring to envision its realization, lived with the familiar dream of his father's return, a dream which had mysteriously embellished his life and somehow lifted it above the level of surrounding lives, so that he could see all sorts of distant and interesting things, just as when as a little boy his father used to lift him by his elbows, thus enabling him to see what was interesting over a fence. After the first evening, when she had renewed her hope and become convinced that the same hope was still alive in her son, Elizaveta Pavlovna no longer referred to it in words, but as usual, it was taken for granted in all their conversations, especially since they did not converse much aloud. Frequently, after several minutes of animated silence, Fedor would suddenly notice that the whole time they had both knew very well what it was about, this double, almost subgramineal speech, which emerged as a single stream, as a word understood to both of them. And sometimes they would play like this, sitting side by side and silently imagining to themselves that each was taking the same Legial walk, that they went out of the park, took the path along the field. There was a river to the left, behind the alders, across the shady graveyard, where sun-flecked crosses were measuring something terribly large with their arms, and where it was somehow awkward to pick up the raspberries, across the river, upwards again through the wood, to another bend of the river, to the Pont de Beches in the farther, through the pines and along the Chemin de Pendu, familiar nicknames not grating to their Russian ears, but thought up when their grandfathers had been children, and suddenly in the middle of their silent walk being performed by two minds, using according to the rules of the game the rate of a human footstep, although they could have flown over their whole domains in a single instant, both stopped and said where they had got to, and where it turned out, as often did, that neither one had outpaced the other, having halted on the same compass. The same smile flashed upon mother and son, and shone through their common tear. Very soon they again got into their inner rhythm of intercourse, for there was little new that they did not already know from letters. She told him in great detail about the recent wedding of Tanya, who had now gone off to Belgium until January with a husband still unknown to Fedor, an agreeable, quiet, very polite, and completely unremarkable gentleman, working in the field of radio, and that when they returned she would move into a new flat with them in an enormous house near one of the Paris gates. She was glad to be leaving the small hotel with its steep dark staircase where she had been living with Tanya in a tiny but many-cornered room, completely swallowed up by a mirror and visited by bedbugs of various caliber, from transparent pink baby ones to leathery brown fatties, which congregated first behind the wall calendar with a Russian landscape by Levitin on it, and when closer to the field of action in the inside pocket of the torn wallpaper directly above the double bed. But the pleasant prospect of a new home was not unmixed with dread. She had an antipathy to her son-in-law, and there was something forced in Tanya's brisk, showy happiness. "You see, he's not quite our set," she confessed, stressing this with a certain tightening of the jaws and a downward look. But that was not all. And anyway, Fedor had already heard about that other man whom Tanya loved, but who did not love her. They went out quite often. As always, Elizaveta Pavlovna seemed to be looking for something, rapidly spanning the world with a skimming glance in her shimmery eyes. The German holiday proved wet. Puddles made the sidewalk seem full of holes. The Christmas tree lights burned dully in the windows, and here and there at street corners a commercial Santa Claus in a red storm coat and with hungry eyes was distributing handbills. In the windows of a department store some villain had the idea of setting up dummy skiers on artificial snow beneath the Star of Bethlehem. Once I saw a modest communist procession walking through the slush with wet flags, most of the marchers battered by life, some crook-backed, others lame or sickly, a lot of plain-looking women and several sedate, petty bourgeois. Fedor and his mother went to have a look at the apartment house where the three of them had lived for 2 years, but the janitor already had changed. The former proprietor had died. Strange curtains hung in the familiar windows, and somehow there was nothing in their hearts could recognize. They visited a cinema where a Russian film was being shown, which conveyed with particular brio the globules of sweat rolling down the glistening faces of the factory workers, while the factory owner smoked a cigar all the time. And of course he took her to see Madame Chernyshevsky. The introduction was not altogether a success. Madame Chernyshevsky met her guest with a doleful tenderness meant to show that the experience of grief had linked them long and closely, but Elizaveta Pavlovna was most of all interested in what the other woman thought of Fedor's verses and in why no one was writing about them. "May I embrace you before you go?" asked Madame Chernyshevsky, preparatorily rising on tiptoe. She was a head shorter than Elizaveta Pavlovna, who bent down toward her with an innocent and radiant smile which quite destroyed the meaning of the embrace. "It's all right, one must be brave," said the lady, letting them out onto the stairs and covering her chin with the end of the downy shawl in which she was wrapped. "One must be brave. I've learned to be so brave that I could give lessons in endurance, but I think you've also come well through this school." "You know," said Elizaveta Pavlovna, stepping lightly but cautiously down the stairs and not turning her lowered head toward her son, "I think I'll just buy cigarette papers and tobacco, otherwise it comes out so dear." And immediately she added in the same voice, "Goodness, how sorry I am for her." And indeed it was impossible not to pity Madame Chernyshevsky. Her husband had been kept over 3 months already in an institute for the mentally ailing, and the semi-loony bin, as he himself playfully expressed it in moments of lucidity. As long ago as October, Fedor had once visited him there. In the sensibly furnished ward sat a fatter, rosier, beautifully shaven, and completely insane Chernyshevsky, in rubber slippers and a waterproof cloak with a hood. "Why, are you dead?" was the first thing he asked, more discontent than surprised. In his capacity as chairman of the Society for Struggle with the Other World, he was continually devising methods to prevent permeation by ghosts. His doctor, employing a new system of logical connivance, did not oppose this, and now, probably on the basis of its non-conductive quality in another sphere, he was trying out rubber, but evidently the results achieved so far were mainly negative, since when Fedor was about to take a chair for himself, which was standing to one side, Chernyshevsky said irritably, "Leave it alone. You see very well there are 2 sitting on it already, and this too in the rustling cloak which plashed up with every movement, and the wordless presence of the attendant, as if this had been meeting in prison, and the whole of the patient's conversation seemed to Fedor an unbearable caricatured vulgarization of that complex, transparent, and still noble, though half-insane state of mind in which Chernyshevsky had so recently communicated with his lost son. With the broad comedy inflections he had formerly reserved for jokes, but which he now used in earnest, he launched into extensive lamentations, all for some reason in German, over the fact that people were wasting money to invent anti-aircraft guns and poison gases and not caring at all about the conduct of another 1,000,000 times more important struggle.